Good afternoon. Today, we will talk about the experimental analysis of behavior according to B.F. Skinner and the concepts of Dollard and Miller. While psychodynamic theory was developing in Europe, American psychology was largely under the influence of behaviorism. In the 1920s, John B. Watson had left academic psychology and other behaviorists were becoming influential, proposing new forms of learning other than classical conditioning. Perhaps the most important of these was B.F. Skinner. Skinner's views were slightly less extreme than those of Watson. Skinner believed that we do have such a thing as a mind, but that it is simply more productive to study observable behavior rather than internal mental events. In this presentation, we will talk about Skinner's concepts and principles, the psychotherapy, his critique, and the concept of humanity. To move on to the discussion, we will be looking first on the biography of Burroughs Frederick Skinner, also known as B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was born on March 20, 1904, in the small Pennsylvania town of Susquehanna. His father was a lawyer and his mother a strong and intelligent housewife. His upbringing was old-fashioned and hardworking. Skinner was an active, outgoing boy who loved the outdoors and building things, and actually his life was not without its tragedies, however. In particular, his brother died at the age of 16 of a cerebral aneurysm. Skinner received his Bachelor of Arts in English from Hamilton College in upstate New York. He didn't fit in very well, not enjoying the fraternity parties or the football games. He wrote for school paper, including articles critical of the school, the faculty, and even Pi Beta Kappa. He wanted to be a writer and did try, sending off poetry and short stories. When he graduated, he built a study in his parents' attic to concentrate, but it just wasn't working for him. Ultimately, he resigned himself to writing newspaper articles on labor problems and lived for a while in Greenwich Village in New York City as bohemian. After some traveling, he decided to go back to school, this time at Harvard. He got his master's in psychology in 1930 and his doctorate in 1931 and stayed there to do research until 1936. Also in that year, he moved to Minneapolis to teach at the University of Minnesota. There he met and soon married Yvonne Blue. They had two daughters, the second of which became famous as the first infant to be raised in one of Skinner's inventions, the air crib. Although in 1945, he became the chairman of the psychology department at Indiana University. In 1948, he was invited to come to Harvard. Skinner was a very active man doing research and guiding hundreds of doctoral candidates as well as writing many books. While not successful as a writer of fiction and poetry, he became one of our best psychology writers, including the book Walden 2, which is a fictional account of community run by his behavior. On August 18, 1990, B.F. Skinner died of leukemia after becoming perhaps the most celebrated B.F. Skinner as radical behaviorism. Skinner had a strong adherence of observable behavior. He shares at least one thing in common with Sigmund Freud. They were being very scientific in his studies of in order to absolutely define his understanding of behavioral principles. Skinner rejected anything he could not observe. Although this allowed him to claim a level of precision in the study of behavior, it disallowed him to the study of mind, consciousness, thinking, emotion, the very things that most people consider to be the domain of psychology. It also disallowed him to do many types of research on humans, and so Skinner, his students, and colleagues focused much of their effort on studying rats and pigeons. Skinner emphasized above all else approaching human behavior scientifically. However, he acknowledged that human behavior is complex and that our familiarity with it makes it difficult for us. Now, we will discuss the concept of B.F. Skinner, the operant conditioning. Skinner is regarded as the father of operant conditioning, but his work was based on Thorndike's law of effect. As a behaviorist, Skinner believed that it was not really necessary to look at internal thoughts and motivations in order to explain behavior. Instead, he suggested we should look only at the external, observable causes of human behavior. Skinner used the term operant to refer to any active behavior that operates upon the environment. Skinner's theory explained how we acquire the range of learned behaviors we exhibit every day. According to the principles of operant conditioning, a behavior that is positively reinforced will likely to reoccur. But information should be presented also in small amounts so that responses can be reinforced. Lastly, reinforcement will generalize across stimuli producing secondary conditioning. F. Skinner identified three types of responses. We have the neutral operants, the reinforcers, and the punishers. First, neutral operants. This is the responses from the environment that neither increase nor decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. Second, we have the reinforcers. These are the responses from the environment that increase the probability of behavior being repeated. On these reinforcers, we have the primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are what you call the stimuli which are naturally reinforcing because they directly satisfy a need. Example, food and water. In line with that, secondary reinforcers, these are stimuli which are reinforcing through their association with a primary reinforcer. For example, money. You cannot eat or drink it, but if you have it, you can buy whatever you want. So a secondary reinforcer can be just as powerful a motivator as a primary. The last type of response is the punisher. These are the responses from the environment that decreases the likelihood of a behavior being repeated, in which punishment For better understanding, we can all think of examples of how our own behavior has been affected by reinforcers and punishers. As a child, you probably tried a number of behaviors and learned from their consequences. For example, if when you were younger you tried smoking at school and the consequence was that you got in with the crowd you always wanted to hang out with, that consequence you would have been positively reinforced and would be likely to repeat the behavior. However, if the main consequence of you smoking at school was that you were caught and suspended and your parents became involved, you would most certainly have been punished, and you would consequently be much less. Under the concept of operant conditioning, we have the positive reinforcement. In positive reinforcement, our response or behavior is strengthened by rewards, leading to the repetition of desired behavior. For example, if your teacher gives you 100 pesos to complete your homework, that is the reward. You will be more likely to repeat this behavior in the future, thus strengthening the behavior of completing. On the other hand, we have the negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is the termination of unpleasant state following a response. This is known as negative reinforcement because it is the removal of adverse stimulus which is rewarding to the animal or person. Negative reinforcement strengthens behavior because it stops or removes an unpleasant experience. For example, if you do not complete your homework or assignment, you will give your teacher a 50 pesos. Because of that, you will complete your homework to avoid paying 50 pesos, thus strengthening the behavior of completing your. As the opposite of reinforcement, we have the punishment. It is the removal of potentially rewarding stimulus. For instance, deducting someone's pocket money. According to Skinner, there are many problems with using punishment, such as punished behavior is not forgotten, it is suppressed. The behavior returns when the punishment is no longer present. Also, it does not necessarily guide towards desired behavior because reinforcement tells you what to do, but according to Skinner, there are schedules of reinforcement. We have the continuous, fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio. Under the schedule of reinforcement, first we have the continuous, wherein the animal or human is positively reinforced every time a specific behavior occurs. For example, a child receives a star for every. Second, we have the fixed ratio reinforcement, wherein the behavior is reinforced only after the behavior occurs a specified number of times. For example, a child receives a star for every 5 words. We have the third schedule, fixed interval reinforcement, wherein one reinforcement is given after a fixed time interval, providing at least one correct response has been made. For example, for every 15 minutes a child finishes a task, he will be. Fourth schedule, we have the variable ratio, wherein the behavior is reinforced after an unpredictable. Last type of schedule is the variable interval reinforcement, wherein providing one correct response has been made. Reinforcement is given after an unpredictable amount of time passed. For example, a self-employed person is being paid. Now, let's go to psychotherapy. Skinner felt that mental illness centered on issues of control and the development of abnormal contingencies in the control of behavior. Skinner believed that when faced with being controlled under excessive conditions, individuals may attempt to escape, revolt, or resist passively. Given the complexity of human life, these behaviors can take many forms and can result in many emotional byproducts such as fear, anxiety, anger, rage. Ralph Skinner viewed psychotherapy as yet another form of control, but one in which the therapist creates a non-punishing situation that allows the patient to B.F. Skinner introduces behavior modification as a set of therapies or techniques based on operant conditioning. The main principle comprises changing environmental events that are related. Examples of behavior modification therapy includes token economy and behavior shaping. Token economy is a system in which targeted behaviors are reinforced with tokens, the secondary reinforcers, and later exchanged for rewards, which is the tokens can be in the form of fake money, poker chips, or stickers, while the rewards can range anywhere from snack to privileges and activities. For example, the teacher used token economy at primary school by giving young children stickers to reward. Token economy has been found to be very effective in managing. As to behavior shaping through successive approximation. To do this, the conditions required to receive the reward should shift each time the organism moves a step closer to the desired. Now let's move on to the short critique of B.F. Skinner's theory. Skinner's theory rated very high on ability to generate research, very high also as to guide in action, and very high as useful theory. He also rated high on falsifiability and moderate on ability. As to the concept of humanity, without doubt, B.F. Skinner held a deterministic view of human nature, and concepts like free will and individual choice had no place in his behavioral analysis. People are not free but are controlled by environmental forces. They may seem to be motivated by inner causes, but in reality, those causes can be traced to sources outside. B.F. Skinner's view on B.F. Skinner's view on human nature is highly optimistic because human behavior is shaped by the principles of reinforcement. The species is quite adaptable. Of all behaviors, the most on the dimension of causality versus teleology, Skinner's theory of personality is very high on causality. Behavior is caused by the person's history of reinforcement as well as by the species contingencies. According to Skinner, although people behave covertly when thinking about the future, all those thoughts are determined by past experiences. The complex of environmental contingencies responsible for these thoughts, as well as for all other behaviors, is beyond. For this reason, we rate Skinner very high on the unconscious dimension of. Although he believed that genetics plays an important role in personality development, Skinner held that human personality is largely the history of a person determines behavior, and because each human has a singular history of reinforcement contingencies, behavior and personality are relatively unique. Genetic differences also account for uniqueness among people. Biological and historical differences mold unique individuals, and Skinner emphasized people's uniqueness more than he did. As the scientific study of behavior continued, it became common to try determining behavior on the basis of mathematical models. In contrast, John Dollard and Neil Miller tried to find some common ground between psychodynamic. Dollard and Miller developed a personality theory that was based on Clark Hall stimulus response. According to Dollard and Miller, human behavior occurs in response to cues. Cues are any stimulus that is recognized as the. According to Dollard and Miller, there are four essential factors involved in learning: the drive, cues, response. The first factor in learning is drive. Drive is defined as the intense stimulus that motivates a response. Second factor is the cues, which is defined as the stimulus that elicits response. Third, response. Response is for reduction of drive. And lastly, reward. Reward in which a person realizes that the response has led to a reward. In order to learn, one must want something, that is a drive. Next, a person must notice something, which is the cues. Then, a person must do something, which is the response. And lastly, a person must get some. Dollard and Miller address the roles of culture and society in the learning process. Thus, social learning and imitation was introduced. Imitation involves matching or copying behavior of another person. Dollard and Miller proposed that psychiatric clinics are full of patients showing three common signs: misery, stupidity, and neurotic symptoms. Basically, Dollard and Miller believe that conflict produces the misery, that repression produces the stupidity, and that neurotic symptoms reduce conflict. However, neurotic symptoms do not solve conflicts. They only mitigate the conflict. In order to better understand these conflicts, Dollard and Miller presented a detailed analysis of conflict. They introduced the three types of conflict, which is approach conflict, the approach avoidance conflict, and avoid. The first type of conflict is the approach conflict, wherein the individual must make a choice between two rewarding stimuli, such as having ice cream or. The second type of conflict is the approach avoidance conflict. In this situation, the rewarding aspect of the stimulus is stronger, so we approach the stimulus. But as we approach, however, the drive to avoid the stimulus grows rapidly until we move away. For example, when an abusive parent tries to comfort a child, there is a drive to move toward the parent for comfort. That is the approach, as well as a drive to avoid further abuse. The last type of conflict is the avoidance conflict, where both of our choices will Okay, that's it. Let's end our presentation of experimental analysis of behavior with B.F. Skinner quote. I did not direct my life, I didn't design it. I never made decisions. Things always came up. Thank you.